Coming up on Chasing the Natty, Week 3 of the 2024 college fantasy football season has come and gone, and we're back once again to teach where you need to pivot going forward in your leagues. We'll be tackling the disappointing performances we continue to see from some high-profile players. We'll talk about some big Week 3 performers you should avoid on the waiver wire, and then we'll get to the part you're all dying to hear, the players you could be adding to your roster, which could help you win your league down the line. We've got all of that and more coming right after this.
Look at GT go. Breaks a tackle. He's 10. He's touchdown. Cook's going to throw the deep ball. And Burton past the defense. Touchdown, Luther Burton. Milroe going to run it again. Got a lane. Kicked in the turbo. Milroe. Goodbye. Touchdown, Bama.
This is Chasing the Natty, a college fantasy football podcast. All right, welcome in everyone. This is Jared Palmgren, host of the Chasing the Natty podcast. I hope you guys are having a wonderful ride to your work on this Monday morning. We are the College Fantasy Football Podcast on the Campus of Canton Podcast Network. You can find us on all of your podcast feeds and on YouTube every Monday and Wednesday morning during the season at 6 a.m. sharp. If you want to support the fantabulous work we are doing here, head on over to campuscant.com, subscribe there with any of our tiers. We have content ranging on all sorts of college football games, whether it's CFF, Devi, C2C, College IDP, College DFS. Really, if you play it, we've got content, whether that's tools, rankings, pretty much everything you need to succeed. If you want to get in touch for whatever reason, you can find me in the show on Twitter. I'm at CFF_Jared. The show is at Chasing a Natty. If you're enjoying what you hear, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe on the YouTube side of things, and if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you leave those 5-star reviews. All of those things help us out a ton. All right, y'all, welcome back. Week 3 is in the books. I hope all of you guys are 3-0 in each and every one of your leagues, and if not, that's also good news because we got plenty of content here to help you turn your teams around here moving forward. Got a lot to get to here this week. I don't know about you guys, but I have spent hours today pouring through a bunch of the games from yesterday, taking a look at some of these weaker performances, taking a look at some of these guys that popped off, and maybe they're real, maybe they're not. I think I've identified a couple of guys here that are not so real, and then of course, which guys do we go with here? I'll go ahead and tell you guys. Quarterbacks and running backs are relatively simple to me this week, but man, wide receivers. If you're on a team right now that is struggling at the wide receiver position, the CFF gods have gifted you a ton of great options for you to pick up off the waiver wire this week. So definitely, if that fits your team's bill, be on the lookout for that here soon. As always, we are here, as I kind of ran through a little bit there, we got 3 main segments here with our waiver wire shows. We'll be talking about our freak out list, some guys that either were high profile to start the year, high profile in drafts that have kind of disappointed since the season started, and how at what level are we here at Campus of Canton freaking out over those players? Myself, Nate Marquise, and Chris K rate those guys 1 to 10. We'll get to that here in a second. I'll go through some guys that were big performers in week 3 that really don't buy the fool's gold on them. There's a couple of guys for that this week, and then as always, of course, just as with any waiver wire show, I got plenty of guys this week. I got 5 quarterbacks, 5 running backs, 6 wide receivers this week, and only 1 tight end. I'll let you know right now, tight end's a bit of a wasteland right now. There's not really a ton of great options out there right now. You had your Jack Beck to start the year, a couple of other guys like Tanner Koziel that popped up last week, but otherwise nobody's really popping up right now. So without further ado, I think we go ahead and get right on into it, y'all. There's not really much else for me to say. So yeah, let's go ahead and get on over to our freak out list of this week. I got 4 players here that I wanted to talk about. Well, not I wanted to talk about. I mean, I don't mind talking about any of these guys, but our NIL tier over at campusofcanton.com, those guys who are subscribed to our website with the NIL tier have been a great help with me each week with the freak out scale. It's a really good way for me to kind of go through and really kind of take a bit of a straw poll real quick to figure out like who do you guys actually want me to talk about? Because I'll be real, I had 7 names that I put, or actually 8 names that I put down, and some of the names I was initially just going to go ahead and talk about, turns out people weren't freaking out about them as much. Like I was thinking about talking about Jalen Royals this week. Actually got the least amount of votes on the poll of our NIL members, and so those guys helped me out a ton. If you want to be a part of that, go subscribe there to our NIL tier over at campusofcanton.com. Over $7.99 a year, or $7.99 a month, $79.99 a year. And by the way, if you get that yearly subscription, all those fancy guides that I talk about during the off season, like our freshman supplemental guide, our Devi guide, and our CFF guide, all of those come included with the yearly subscription of the NIL tier. So a little bit more incentive for you there. So without further ado, I'll finish shouting out our NIL members over on our Discord. But they kind of narrowed it down to 4 guys for me here today. And the first guy that they wanted me to talk about, and this was easily the number 1 guy that was asked for in that poll, was Ricky White, wide receiver out of UNLV. To give you guys an idea, again, myself, Nate Marquise, and Chris K are the 3 who participate in the Freakout scale every single week. We rank every one of our players from a scale of 1 to 10. 1 is start with confidence, 10 is drop that fool, and then you got some tiers in the middle. 3 is like monitor closely. 5, start looking for a backup plan. The way I interpret that is go grab somebody of the same position off the waiver wire just in case this starts, this continues to be a problem. And then 8 is like bench them now, like don't put them in your starting lineup at all this week. And then again, 10 is just drop them. So first guy up here is Ricky White. This one's definitely, I see why people are freaking out about him, and I'm not going to pretend like I'm just brushing this off here, right? I personally have this at a 6, so a little bit above, look for a backup plan. I still think Ricky White is startable in certain leagues. The thing is, though, I would take advantage of a week like this, right, where you have a ton of great wide receiver options on the board and try to pick up some backup options in case things continue to go south with UNLV's passing game. Now, what do I mean by that? UNLV's passing game has definitely become a bit of an issue here. And shout out Chris Moxley. I'm just going to say it, he was right. I had this whole spiel during the offseason that there wasn't going to be a problem with Matthew Sluka coming in and becoming the quarterback for UNLV. I was like diving into his advanced metrics, like can he actually throw the ball down the field? And I was thinking like, okay, it was his system. They didn't want him to pass the ball as much. They wanted him to run a little bit more. Nope, because UNLV is doing the exact same thing with him now, to the tune of 16 passes from Sluka per game. And that is extremely low volume for any offense in the country. Yeah, it speaks for itself. Any team that's throwing the ball 16 times a game is like bordering on triple option in terms of the amount of passes. And maybe not that extreme, but you guys get what I mean, right? Like the average team's going to throw between 20 to 30 times per game. If you're throwing 16 times a game, that's a very low volume and a very difficult place for a CFF wide receiver to exist, because that's just volume that cannot be relied upon every single week. But here's kind of the kicker. Ricky White has 21 out of the 49 targets for UNLV so far. That's a whopping 42.8% of targets. I do some projections on the side, and I'm letting you guys know right now, I never feel comfortable putting a wide receiver with higher than 35% of targets, because that's just the kind of stuff that doesn't happen. But here it is. I guess that's what happens when you get these wonky low volume of passing here. But yeah, like that's the way that Ricky White is still kind of sustaining himself right now. He has 21 targets to this point, which if you're doing the math between 3 games, that is 7 targets per game. So there's still a path for Ricky White to be good here, right? He had a phenomenal week 2, right, with 3 touchdowns on that day. But there's definitely still a lot here to clearly show that he is not going to be the same wide receiver that he was last year for CFF, right? His targets have gone down from 9.58 per game last year to 7 this year. His efficiency's taken a really big hit from 17.4 yards per catch now down to 12.6. All 3 of his touchdowns came in a single game, so it's not like they're getting him end zone opportunities every single game here. I think that I'm definitely at a 6. I think there's a way for White to bounce back. Again, let's get it a little bit more consistent with the touchdowns here, right? But regardless, definitely not the same wide receiver as last year. I'm looking for some backup options off the waiver wire this year or this week. Take advantage of the plethora of options there and start planning a backup option. Next player, not character. What am I talking about? This is not a storybook. Noah Fifita, quarterback out of Arizona. I was kind of surprised to see people ask about this. Not because I don't think he's worth freaking out about, but mostly because a lot of people, Fifita, a lot of people have been asking about guys, being drafted in the top 4 rounds. Meanwhile, Fifita kind of was a bit down there in terms of his ADP, right? Like you can usually get him in like the 6th through 10th round. He kind of varied quite a bit there, but I got a ton of requests for him this weekend. So here we are. And between myself, Nate Marquise, and Chris K, Nate and I have him as an 8. Chris K's got him as a 9. Things are looking bleak for Noah Fifita. He fits the kind of archetype of quarterback that can really fall apart for CFF, and that is, passing quarterback in a system that doesn't force him to throw it an absurd number of times, right? Like he'll have some games, right, where, game script's going to force him to throw it, just like this past week against Kansas State. He threw it 42 times in that game. But on average, he's thrown between 25 and 30 times per game. That's not something you really want to see in a CFF quarterback that is also not running. That's also the main problem with Fifita, is that he's just not a runner. Last year, he was extremely efficient down the stretch with Jedd Fisch. He fit that system perfectly. I don't think this transition to Brett Brennan's system's quite going as smoothly as we want it to be. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that as much as we in the CFF community absolutely adore the volume that Ted McMillan's getting, it's a big problem for this offense just in general for CFF. Ted McMillan has 33 targets. The next closest wide receiver to him is Montana Lamonius Craig, and he has 10. There's a huge disparity there. McMillan's got 4 touchdowns. The only other wide receiver to have a receiving touchdown is Jeremiah Patterson, and he only has the 1. This is a very big issue for this offense, and quite frankly, like I said, it's leading to offensive struggles that are just making Fifita unsustainable for CFF. They got 22 points versus North Arizona. They got 7 points versus Kansas State last year. Last year, this was an offense that could keep up in shootouts. I don't think that they're able to do that this year. Because, yeah, maybe Arizona gets into a shootout, but all these Big 12 defenses, and they will have some guys that are able to do it somewhat, all they need to do is bracket Ted McMillan. No other receivers really stepping up. Fifita doesn't have chemistry with anybody else, and so that's going to lead to some really big-time disappointments down the stretch for Fifita. I'm personally very close to dropping him in any redraft leagues. I have him in a dynasty league. I'm not quite there, but man, I don't plan on starting him anytime soon. So he's at an 8 for me. Nate's got him at an 8. Chris has got him at a 9. So let's move on to our other 2 options here on the freakout scale. Our next guy here is Rock Taylor, the wide receiver out of Memphis. This is definitely one of the more surprising performances I have seen so far this year. It is, quite frankly, a little head scratching. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with this offense to where Taylor's just been very, very much neutered here so far this season. Really, again, I can't tell if it's a passing game. I can't tell if it's just their game plans. Last year, Rock Taylor was looking at being pretty CFF relevant because of the fact that he had 94 targets on the year, caught 60 of them, almost hit 1,000 yards at 981. Had a bit of a touchdown problem, only had 4 touchdowns on 981 yards. But regardless, all we needed was that touchdown number to regress just a little bit, and he should have been an absolute dynamite receiver for CFF this year. We're just not seeing that this year. Currently, as it stands, Rock Taylor is only second in targets on the team. He's not even first in targets. Last year, he broke away from the team a little bit. Now he's sitting one target behind Damir Blakumsey through 3 games here, and he's only 2 targets ahead of Kobe Drake. I can't really figure out what's going on here because Memphis isn't passing it any less. I just think they're spreading it around a little bit more, and Kobe Drake getting involved in this passing game is really eating into both Blakumsey and Rock Taylor quite a bit. But here's also the other thing. The receiving option or the receiving opportunities for touchdowns just have not been there so far. Great. So you can say there's a little bit of touchdown luck, but also Memphis is making a very conscious decision that when they're in the red zone, they're running the ball. Their running backs have 7 touchdowns altogether throughout this year. Meanwhile, the top 3 wide receivers for Memphis so far between Blakumsey, Taylor, and Drake have a whopping combined 0. Right? So I'm not really sure what to think about with Rock Taylor moving forward. I kind of do, right? I have him rated as a 7. Chris K's got him rated as a 7 with me as well. Nate's a little bit more optimistic at 6, but not by much. This is a problem. This Memphis passing the ball or spreading the ball around is definitely a problem. If Rock Taylor continues on this pace through 3 games, there's only 16 targets. Multiply that by 4 over 12 games. You're looking at a season where he finishes with 64 targets on the year. Now, maybe things get a little bit better once they get into AAC play, right? There's a lot more opportunities for shootouts there. Memphis's competition has not been super tough so far this year. They've had an FCS opponent, they've had Troy, and then they had Florida State last week, which Memphis was totally okay with turning into a rock'em sock'em, slow it down kind of game. I am very much concerned about Rock Taylor, especially since, again, he's not breaking away from the competition here, right? He's also, again, his efficiency's down a little bit. It's not, the worst thing in the world. He's gone from 16.4 last year to 14.9 this year. I'm much more worried about the fact that his target numbers per game going from, let's see if I can do math off the top of my head, going around 8 targets per game to now down to around 5, just over 5 targets per game. That has to turn around very quickly for me to feel better about Rock Taylor moving forward. Last name that we need to discuss here is Kadin Salter, quarterback out of Liberty. This is very much a name I got a ton of requests after a 3rd disappointing performance in a row from Salter so far. And a lot of people are freaking out, with good reason, right? Again, 3 disappointing performances in a row. This guy was the number 1 overall pick in a couple of leagues, but almost always within the top half of the first round, almost always the first quarterback off the board. He seemed like an absolute shoo-in for more CFF production this year, given the fact that he was the QB1 overall in CFF last year. So what's going on? What's going on, Jared? Why is Salter not doing this? Why is he not doing as well? And I'm going to tell you guys, to me, the answer is very simple. It's just bad touchdown luck. Because let me break this down for you. And to be very clear, let me get through the freak out scale real quick. I have him as a 5 because I do think that it's okay for you to start looking for some backup quarterback options. But I don't blame Nate for having him as a 4 and Chris K for having him as a 3. I do think Salter will get going at some point. I legit think it's just some really bad touchdown luck. Here's why. Let's take a look at some of his passing numbers from this last year to this year, right? You would think that if there's a reason to be concerned, his volume would be down, right? His pass attempts per game last year was 24.83. That has actually gone up this year. He is actually up to 28.7 pass attempts per game because he's actually been in a few more competitive games than he was to start last year. So he actually has to throw a little bit more this year. His completion percentage, maybe that's down. Nope. 2023, it was 58.7%. It's actually improved to 65.3%. He's looking really good. Maybe his efficiency's down. What's his yards per attempt? Yards per attempt last year, 10.0. This year, 10.1. If anything, his opportunities in the passing game have actually increased. He's actually doing better in passing than he was last year. So what about rushing? This is where things take a little bit of a dip, I will fully admit. In 2023, he had 12 rushing attempts per game and had 6.2 yards per attempt. Now he has about 8.6 rushing attempts per game and is down to about 4.4 yards per attempt. Now, you might be saying to me like, "Oh my gosh, Jared, that sounds like a pretty big drop there, right? Like he has almost 5 less attempts per game, and you're looking at, almost 2 yards less per attempt. Like that's got to be a huge chunk of his fantasy points." Actually not. Because when you take the difference between his attempts per game, right? So that leaves you with 4.7 attempts less per game, and then you have 1.8 yards per attempt less than last year. You multiply those two together, that actually gets you to 6.6 yards per game less on rushing. Or in another way, that's 0.6 fantasy points less per game than he's getting last year in the rushing department. So that's not what's causing him to be a problem, right? It's everything to do with bad touchdown luck. Let's look at what Kadin Salter last year, or take a look at his rushing touchdowns through 3 games. So far in 2024, he has 0 rushing touchdowns through 3 games. Last year, he had 3 to this point. Let's look at his passing touchdown numbers. This year, he has 3 passing touchdowns through 3 games. Last year, he had 9. Right? Everything else stays the same. It's just the fact that the team's scoring a little bit less, the touchdown opportunities aren't as high. That's a little bit of a red flag, considering their competition has not been the toughest to this point. They're not running up the score like they did last year. But even still, I went back and looked. The opportunities, it's not like they're just refusing to run Salter near the goal line now. They've had a couple of opportunities where they've given him chances he just can't get in, so they just bulldoze it in with one of their running backs, right? Some of the touchdown opportunities that he was given last year, he's just not being given this year, and that can probably change as the season goes on. Liberty's schedule, just like always, is cake in that CUSA schedule. Salter's going to be fine. He is just having some really, really bad touchdown luck throughout right now. Those touchdown numbers are going to regress to the mean, a positive regression here. There's no way that this staff is going to continue to think that a quarterback like Salter, who they grabbed back out of the portal, I might add, they're going to continue to let him have only 3 total touchdowns through 3 games. That's not going to continue. So I'm not worried about Salter. I just in case, I would maybe target a quarterback out of the waiver wire this week. So that's why I got him out of 5. But honestly, if I'm being honest, I probably moved this down to a 4. Once I really dug into this, I'm really not as worried about Salter as I thought I would be. So that is our freakout scale for this week. Let me take a sip of some tea, and we'll be on to our waiver wire traps for this week. All right, let's get into this. So I'm going to try to go through these faster and faster each week. I go through them pretty slow to start the season because got a lot of new listeners, and I need people to understand a lot of my thought processes when it comes to exactly why I wave off certain players, certain performances. But by the time week 3, week 4, really as the season goes on, if I really dove deep into everything, it would start sounding really repetitive. And so I'm going to try to go through these pretty quickly here. I'm not really planning on spending really much longer than, I would say, 5-10 minutes on this segment. We got a lot to get to with the actual waiver wire pickups for this week. So let's start off with our first waiver wire trap of the week, and that's Jake Ratliff, the quarterback out of BYU. I actually like Jake Ratliff. I think he could actually do pretty solid for the Cougars, but for right now, I'm just not seeing it based on the performances we've gotten so far. He has some serious mirages when it comes to his performances. His only 2 performances that have been good so far have come against Southern Illinois University and then Wyoming. 2 G5 opponents in which he threw for 3 touchdowns each in those games. The one game that he's had against Power 4 level competition is SMU, a team that has clearly struggled with everybody else, and his performance in that game was extremely lackluster. 2 interceptions, 15 for 28, only just above 200 yards on the day. He did run a little bit, so that was kind of nice, but ended the day with 15.8 or 18, oh my goodness, 15.58 fantasy points. only a single touchdown to his name in that game. And to me, maybe I'm being a little harsh here, but I think that's more indicative of what we're going to get as BYU gets into more Big 12 play. Because BYU overall is just not a good roster. I think they're going to struggle in the Big 12 this year. I wouldn't be surprised if they finish near the bottom of the standings. Their next 3 games are Kansas State, Baylor, and Arizona. Maybe there's some opportunity with those games because I know Arizona's defense is not the greatest in the world, but regardless, I'm not trusting Ratliff based on, off the limited sample we've gotten so far. He struggles against Power 4 competition. BYU in general struggles against Power 4 competition, and they're beating up on some of these lesser teams. So I'm not going to go after Ratliff this week. I don't care that he scored almost 30 points. Next player up here, Zuberi Mobley, the running back out of Florida Atlantic. This is a guy that I know a couple people have kind of championed a little bit this week, and why not? Again, 20 rushing attempts, 134 yards last week, 3 touchdowns on the ground. It looks great, and he really kind of fits maybe this potential archetype that I was talking about last week, these committee busters, right? I'm not buying this one. This is just a little bit too much of a jump here, right? He had 10 carries against Michigan State in week 1 for 36 yards. Against Army, which Florida Atlantic got absolutely destroyed by. He only had 3 attempts for 8 yards in that game. Granted, they were losing, so, game script took him out of it there. But regardless, it's a very big jump to all of a sudden go from that to 20 attempts, 6.7 yards per carry, 3 touchdowns when he hadn't scored a touchdown in the first 2 weeks there. I think this is a hot hand situation. I think Florida Atlantic, given the fact that, he was doing well. And honestly, if you take away his big run there of 72 yards, he actually was pretty pedestrian on the day. Now that I'm thinking about it, because you take away that big rush, that leaves 19 attempts for 62 yards. That means you're just averaging just over 3 yards per attempt. I don't think that Mobley is going to be a guy that you're going to be able to rely on week to week. FAU's not a good team. They're going to be behind quite a bit of games. And as we can see in that Army game, that spells doom for Mobley. So I'm not picking him up. Another guy to take a look at this year or this week in terms of not picking them up is Deshaun Bishop, the running back out of Tennessee. Couple of reasons why here. One, classic case of hyper efficiency against a bad opponent and also benefiting from injury. Like Cam Seldon hasn't fully come back for Tennessee yet. And Bishop, while looking good, is not going to be able to perform this week in and week out, especially when, again, he's clearly RB2 behind Dylan Sampson, who had his own monster game this past weekend. But Bishop going 7 attempts for 120 yards and 2 touchdowns, averaging 17 yards per carry. Guys, you guys know me. That's way too efficient, way too high to expect. Clearly a beneficiary of a blowout. Don't go after Deshaun Bishop this week. Next guy up here is wide receiver True Edwards out of Louisiana Tech. Couple of things here. One, I'm not a big fan of Louisiana Tech's offense this year. I think that is a team that has struggled mightily to figure out what they want to do on offense. And maybe this performance that True Edwards did this past week against North Carolina State is good enough to earn him more targets. Maybe he becomes the best piece on a bad team, and that could benefit him down the line. But I'm not basing that off of one performance here where he was targeted 5 times, so not a super high target share right there. Caught 4 of them for 148 yards, so that's 37 yards per reception, and a touchdown. That just so many red flags. Low targets, hyper efficiency on those targets. It is against a power 4 level opponent, so I'll give him credit there. Like, I'm not rooting against True Edwards here. Like, if this kind of performance earns him more targets in the next couple of weeks, I'll eat some crow on it. But for right now, if you go after True Edwards and you're just going after the guys who scored well last week, I think you're going to be disappointed with Edwards in the coming week. So I would avoid him. And the last guy I'll avoid here, this one I'm kind of back and forth. I'll be real. There weren't a ton of obvious guys to avoid on the waiver wire this week. So I'll just go with Kelly Joyner, the running back / wide receiver out of South Florida here. He's had 2 performances like this so far this year against lesser competition for South Florida, where, once again, hyper efficient, a lot of touchdowns on low attempt numbers here. He had 10 carries for 117 yards and 2 touchdowns last week. This is a full committee situation here. He's rotating in there with Naquan Wright. Obviously, Byron Brown gets his own share of the rushing attempts. None of these guys are ever going to get to a point where they're rushing the ball 20 plus times a game. And so I'm going to be jumping off a jointer here because, as we saw, again, he looks good. Don't get me wrong. Again, against Bethune-Cookman, against Southern Miss, again, he's had solid days, but until those rushing attempts go up, I think people are going to be mostly pretty disappointed with Joyner moving forward. So I am off of that. All that being said, let's get to the part you guys really want to talk about. Let's talk about these quarterbacks. Let's talk about these waiver wire pickups for week 3. And the first guy we're going to touch on here, in my opinion, might be one of the most important waiver wire pickups we've had until this point this year, and that is Kadin Camp, quarterback out of West Kentucky, rostered in 10% of leagues. Before we really dive into Camp here, I kind of want to touch on just West Kentucky's offense in general. The Hilltoppers are currently, for those of you who don't know, on their 4th play caller in as many years. We've had some incredible years with the Hilltoppers recently. Obviously, Zach Kitley in 2021 was phenomenal. Followed that up with Ben Arbuckle, who did not skip a beat. Last year, with Drew Hollingshead, the Western Kentucky offense wasn't terrible, but it was clearly a step back from what we had seen. He lost his play calling duties at one point during the season. They now bring in Will Friend, who was actually an offensive line coach before this, to be the offensive coordinator. And with all that, it's understandable that level of turnover is going to cause diminishing returns for this offense in general. As much as we want to view this offense as like a clear CFF, like they're just going to run this offense back every single year for Western Kentucky. They're trying to recreate 2021 over and over again. It's going to be harder and harder to do that every year when you have this coaching turnover. So, all that to be said, things are still to be determined under Will Friend here, right? We didn't see a very hot start for quarterback TJ Finley for fantasy purposes here. I think part of that's pretty understandable. One, they started with Alabama, in which case Finley only threw for 92 yards. Bama absolutely crushed them. I'm not holding that against him or this offense. The next week was disappointing for Finley as well, but it's kind of the same thing as Kadin Salter I was just talking about ago. I think there was just some bad touchdown luck in that game, right? Finley threw the ball 39 times. That's pretty good volume there. 351 yards, pretty good passing production. So to me, like, the bones of a good CFF performances were just there, but we saw way more running backs get touchdowns in that game than I think we've ever seen from Western Kentucky the last couple of years. So obviously that itself was a little bit concerning, right? But, teams have fluky performances like that, right? Even the best air raid systems sometimes have games where their running backs are the ones scoring the touchdowns. There's nothing you really can do to explain or predict that, right? So to me, like, I thought the signs were there for pretty productive offense from West Kentucky, but unfortunately for Finley and also myself for calling the start of Finley last week in my start show, Finley would not see the benefits of this. As during the first drive against MTSU last week, he went down with an injury. So who comes along? Mr. Kadin Camp. For those of you who do not remember, Camp made his claim to fame back in, I believe, December was when the bowl game was, against Old Dominion, where the Hilltoppers had a massive come from behind victory to win 38-35 in overtime after being down 28-0 at the beginning of the second quarter. That day, Camp was a legend for the Hilltoppers. He threw the ball 52 times for 383 yards and 5 touchdowns. Also ran the ball 19 times for 53 yards. With that kind of performance, I thought, and many of us thought, we had seen the birth of the next great Western Kentucky quarterback. Unfortunately, the staff thought differently, which is why they added TJ Finley out of the portal. But it looks like Veltkamp's ascension here has just been delayed. Unfortunately, it required Finley going down with injury, but Veltkamp came in, took his place this past week, and just absolutely wowed the CFF community. He was the number one scoring player in all of CFF this past week. On the day against Middle Tennessee, Veltkamp threw the ball 30 times for 398 yards and 5 touchdowns. He also added a touchdown on the ground. He didn't run as much as he did in the bowl game, obviously, but still good to see that he was able to get in the end zone that way. The efficiency and completion percentage here, to me, obviously is pretty whack here. The 90% completion percentage is not something I'm going to expect from Veltkamp every single week, but clearly, he can run this offense super well. I'm not sure what was holding the staff back from starting him. Also, 13.3 yards per attempt. I'm not expecting that from Veltkamp every single week here. The efficiency will come down. He'll come down to earth with some of these performances, but regardless, I don't need him to do this every single week if he's going to be this good in this offense, right? As long as Finley's out, and it does look like he will be out for a while. He came out in crutches during the game, so it looks like he will be out for a while. I'll be real. Given how Veltkamp's playing, I don't think he's giving up this job again. And as long as Western Kentucky's going to be playing against some CUSA competition, history tells us we're looking at a pretty strong fantasy stud in Veltkamp, especially if they start letting him run the ball a little bit more again. To me, he is the must-add of the week when it comes to any players out there. I would put, in Dynasty, if he's some available in your league, I would put some serious fob down on Veltkamp moving forward. Next quarterback here that we will discuss is Mr. Billy Edwards, the quarterback out of Maryland, rostered in 9% of leagues. Last week, he passed the ball 43 times for 263 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also ran the ball 9 times for 12 yards and a touchdown on the ground as well. Billy Edwards becoming a solid CFF quarterback. I both should be surprised and shouldn't be surprised. I should be surprised because Edwards for years was really nothing more than a goal line wildcat quarterback for this offense. And what we had seen out of his career, I never really expected him to be a full-time starter for the Terrapins. So, to give you guys an idea, right, his one start in 2023 where he played the whole game, he had 30% completion percentage. So my thought was okay, Maryland's going to go to the transfer portal, and they did. They went and grabbed MJ Morris out of NC State, that a CFF community favorite. And so you can imagine my surprise when buzz started circulating in the fall that Edwards was not only beating out MJ Morris, but actually beating him out pretty handedly. And now, 3 games of the season, you can imagine my surprise as I watch him and as I keep up with him. He's turned himself into a solid startable option in most leagues. First 3 weeks of the game against UConn, 24.34 fantasy points. Against Michigan State, 24.22. Against Virginia last week, 25.72. That's some seriously crazy consistency from Edwards so far. Over his first 3 games, he's hit 250 plus passing yards in every game. He's had 2 touchdowns in every game, and he scored a rushing touchdown in 2 of his last 3 games. Right? While it does not appear to me that Edwards can offer the upside of some other CFF options, I do think there's certainly some value in someone like him that I think you can get a pretty projectably high floor every single week. And this is the part of why I don't think this shouldn't be all that surprising, given what we saw out of Talia Tagovailoa the last 3 years, right? In 2021, Tagovailoa finished as the QB 28. In 2022, Tagovailoa would have finished as the QB 38 had he played all 12 games in 2022. And then last year, in 2023, he finished as the QB 26. Because he did exactly what Billy Edwards was doing. He's just mostly a solid option every single week. He might have some flashes, might have some duds. But regardless, most weeks you can plug him in as long as the matchup isn't too crazy or too bad. You're looking at him getting somewhere between 23 to 26, 27 points. And to me, that is a pretty major piece for CFF teams that are kind of looking for some consistency in their roster, right? If you got a really boom or bust option at quarterback that you're really reliant on some matchups, Edwards could be a pretty big piece for you to grab and just play strategically whenever your big boys are not matching up well with their games. Speaking of, though, I have to add this pretty major caveat with Edwards is the final 6 games for Maryland this year are brutal. Here's their schedule to end the year. USC, Minnesota, Oregon, Rutgers, Iowa, Penn State. His next 3 games are great. He's got Villanova, Indiana, and then Northwestern after that. But after that, boy, I don't know if I trust this Maryland offense against that stretch of a schedule right there. So I say all this to say, like, I love him for the next 3 weeks. I think he'll be great when a lot of your guys are on bye over the next 4 weeks. My thing is, like, I really need to see, I better see a really good performance in that first week against USC. Otherwise, his value could dip very, very greatly. Next guy up we'll discuss here, Tucker Gleason, quarterback out of Toledo, rostered on 21% of leagues. This is a guy that I have liked for a couple of years now because we've been teased over and over again for multiple years at Toledo with him. He is a former Georgia Tech quarterback. He's waited patiently behind DeQuan Finn really since the 2021 season. This dude's been waiting for his chance for a long time. We saw him start multiple times with Finn continuously going down to injury, feels like every single year. Guess what? Finn's injured again this year. Shocker. Many of these performances, though, with Gleason over this time have kind of showed an upside that could be very lethal in CFF if truly unlocked. One that really comes to mind is his Bowling Green performance in 2022, where he passed for 329 yards with 3 touchdowns and also had 106 yards and 2 touchdowns on the ground. So now Gleason's finally getting his chance, and he's been pretty solid so far. Again, he's had 21.68 fantasy points, 22.4 fantasy points, and then shocker of all shockers, he had 27.4 fantasy points in a blowout win over Mississippi State at Mississippi State. I cannot explain to you how that happened, but good on Gleason, man. And to me, it shows that he can perform pretty much well against anybody for his schedule moving forward. Again, he's got some really nice matchups in the next couple of weeks. He's got Western Kentucky this week. He's got a bye after that, but then Miami of Ohio. Pretty much straight into MAC play after that. The thing with Gleason, though, is that he's not known as a passer, right? He's had a couple of pretty major stinker performances throwing the ball, including one already this season, right? In the game against UMass of all teams, he only completed 8 of his 23 passes. So he's got a pretty low floor when it comes to some of his passing. But it really does seem like the Rockets are going to be riding on this passing offense more than we expected. While the loss of DeQuan Finn at quarterback seemed like a pretty major blow, it does appear that the loss of Penny Boone at running back might have even been a bigger impact, because this rushing game for Toledo just does not have a go-to, does not have the identity that's had the last couple of years. They're rotating between Willie Shaw Jr., Connor Wellenzak, sorry, that's the name I screw up every time, and then Jacquez Stewart, right? Jacquez Stewart, a guy that we all kind of liked going into the season, and now he's just full-blown committee. In fact, third among these 3 guys. None of them are averaging over 4.5 yards per carry. It is something that this Rockets team is not going to be able to rely on. This has led to Gleason getting a load of opportunities through the air, which so far this season has resulted in him getting 3 touchdowns in every single game so far. I don't know if that sustains throughout the rest of the season, but regardless, like, if none of these running backs step up, they have to rely on Gleason, which I don't blame them. It also helps the fact that he has 2 top-end MAC receivers in Junior Vanderes and Herjuan Newton. So if Gleason keeps up this passing and his legs get even more fully unleashed, he's been running a little bit. He's, you're looking at, about 30 to 40 rushing yards a game so far. Pretty nice floor there, as long as he's not sacked. If he keeps that up and his legs get even more unleashed, I think he could be absolutely dynamite as soon as MAC, really as soon as this week, right? Again, I love the matchup against Western Kentucky, and then it's almost straight MAC play from here on then. So Next quarterback I want to bring up is Mr. Alan Bowman, the quarterback out of Oklahoma State, rostered on 19% of leagues. I'm going to deviate slightly here because I want to talk about Ollie Gordon here for a second. What's going on with Ollie Gordon, man? It's not been looking good the past couple of weeks. He's gotten some volume, 17 attempts in the last 2 3 but he's averaged under 3 yards per carry. Only the 1 touchdown against Arkansas, which if I'm being real, he got lucky, right? He got lucky with some, I don't want to say it was terrible officiating, but some screwy officiating that led to that game having an overtime period, and that's where Gordon scored his touchdown. So, regardless, Gordon is a concern right now, and I personally I don't think he's healthy. I really, really think that there was talk during the fall camp of him getting injured. He looked good in game 1, 27 carries, 104 yards, and 2 touchdowns in that game also, 4 catches, 42 yards, and another touchdown. He looked like Ollie Gordon in that game. After that, though, man, it has just been an uphill battle. Regardless of what's going on with Gordon, Alan Bowman is a huge beneficiary of what's going on with Gordon. Because last year, Gordon became the automatic touchdown monster for Oklahoma State. You got within the red zone, you were just going to hand it to Ollie Gordon until they punched into the end zone. When they can't do that now with Ollie Gordon for whatever reason, Bowman is basically now the opposite of Kadin Salter, where he's getting more of these touchdown opportunities. Last year in 14 games, Bowman threw for a total of 15 touchdowns. Through 3 games so far, he has thrown for 9 touchdowns. Through 3 games, he has already 60% of his touchdown production from last year. It really helps that Bowman's also playing in an offense that is pretty sneakily fast-paced, right? Bowman has been able to run plenty of plays per game. He's quietly had some pretty insane passing attempt numbers. Last year, in 6 of his final 11 games, he had 40-plus attempts. He had 34-plus attempts in all of them. So far this year, he's had 31 attempts in every game so far, despite having Ollie Gordon. And you know how many plays Ollie Gordon gets handed to him every single week. And so Oklahoma State's been running a ton of plays every single week. So that makes for a lot of really good opportunities for Bowman to continue to do what he's doing here so far. The other thing I want to point out is that Oklahoma State, compared to last year, at least in my opinion, is making much better use of its receiving weapons. Last year, it really took a while for them to really kind of hone in on, Presley and Owens as their 2 main guys. This year, they got their starting trio. It's Dejon Stribling, more on him later, Rashad Owens, and Brendan Presley. And they know they're 3 guys, and they know how to utilize them well this year. They're the best, in my opinion. I think they're the best starting trio of wide receivers in the Big 12. I don't know how hot of a take that is, but I look through, and probably the only ones that really come to mind are potentially Colorado, obviously with Travis Hunter there. But I'm not entirely sure, how the rest stack up to the other guys here. I'm trying to think of any other team that in the Big 12 that might match them. No, because Texas is gone. Yeah, I'm going to stand by it. I think Oklahoma State has the best trio of wide receivers in the Big 12. Continuing on with Allen here, right? He threw for 3,460 yards last season. He's currently on pace for 3,826 passing yards. Now, granted, again, he hasn't hit full conference play yet. But regardless, that's a pretty insane floor for him if he can kind of keep up what he's doing here so far. And then if he can double his touchdown output from last year in the regular season, which he had 12 regular season touchdowns last year, and if he can get to 24 touchdowns in 12 games this year, he could finish as high as QB 33. And then if he keeps his current pace, which is 3 touchdowns per game so far, and he gets 36 touchdowns on the year, which is a massive jump from last year, you're looking at a top 20 QB on the year, and he's just sitting on there at waiver wires right now. I think that Bowman is absolutely a grab right now. I don't love his matchup this week against Utah, but in Big 12 play, where there's a ton of opportunity for shootouts, I think Bowman's going to be a massive benefit over the next couple of weeks. Last quarterback I want to throw out here is Sam Leavitt, quarterback out of Arizona State, rostered in 22% of leagues. I'm going to go through this one pretty quickly because I don't think he's like Billy Edwards, but lesser a little bit, right? Billy Edwards, very safe floor quarterback, plug and play during bye weeks. I think Sam Levitt can fill a similar role here, at least so far this season, right? His 3 games, 23 fantasy points in week 1, 21.5 against Mississippi State in week 2, and 23.8 this past week against Texas State. That's, of course, assuming 4-point passing touchdown leagues. Regardless, again, safe floor every week here based on what he's done so far. I actually think that his rushing floor makes him pretty enticing moving forward because he had 8 attempts for 47 yards against Wyoming, and if you take out his sack yardage, he actually reached 61 rushing yards in that game. Against Mississippi State, he had 68 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns, and then against Texas State, 40 rushing yards and a touchdown there. If he can really figure out this passing game, which it really looks like that Jordan Tyson is really coming on for them as wide receiver 1 right now, probably could see him on the waiver wire list here in a week or two. I would say that, again, Levitt, given his rushing, I think that, safe floor with the potential for some higher ceilings if he really gets into some strong shootouts here down the line. Probably the main concern is, he's got Scotabo there in the backfield, and Scotabo is going to want to be fed. And so that'll probably limit his passing attempts numbers, right? He's at 22, 20, and 30 in his first 3 games here. So not loving it, but again, I love some of these matchups coming up. He's got Texas Tech this week, got a bye, but then Kansas, then Cincinnati down the line, Oklahoma State, UCF, Kansas State, BYU, Arizona. That's a nice schedule for Levitt down the line. I think he can be a pretty solid add at quarterback. Honorable mentions I'll go through here pretty quickly. Curtis Rourke, quarterback out of Indiana, has got my eye right now. 2 solid back-to-back performances here. 30 points in week 2 against an FCS opponent. And then this week against UCLA, boy, oh boy, did Rourke take it to them. 300 yards through the air, 4 touchdowns. I'm a little concerned that, again, this is going to be a very up and down player for Indiana, especially as Indiana gets deeper and deeper into this Big Ten schedule. Yeah, they took down UCLA, but UCLA is expected to be probably one of the worst Big Ten teams this year. So good on them for destroying a lesser opponent. But I don't know. I'm still not entirely convinced. I need to see a little bit more out of it. He does have Charlotte this week, and given what we've seen so far, what Indiana does to lesser competition, they're more than willing to run up the score on them. So I think that I'm absolutely willing to grab Rourke and start him for at least 1 week this week. The other honorable mention I have here is Arch Manning. Honestly, if Arch's rostership was just a little bit lower, he would be in the same tier to me as Kadin Camp right now. He's probably only starting against UL Monroe right now, but man, oh man, he's been so on fire when he's been out there. Again, this past week, 4 touchdown passes on 12 attempts, 223 yards, another long touchdown on the ground. He really, really looked good, and it's going to be a problem for Texas moving forward because Quinn will come back, and every time that he has a problem, people are going to be chanting for Arch Manning because, man, Arch Manning's looked really good. Problem is, Arch Manning's also looked really good against Colorado State and UTSA, 2 teams that when you look at what they've done against some other opponents, neither one of those teams have looked really, really good so far. That's not to say Arch Manning is not a good quarterback. I'm just saying that maybe we dial back the expectations just a little bit if he does end up starting. But regardless, he's got UL Monroe on deck this week, so I think if you want to start him for just this 1 week, I don't blame you whatsoever. He's available in 2/3 of leagues right now. I take advantage of it. All right, let's move on to some running backs here. I'll try to pick up the pace just a little bit here. Theme of the week for running backs, though. I mentioned it last week with a lot of my honorable mentions and Henry Parrish when I brought him up. The idea of these committee busters, right? Like teams that typically employ a committee approach for their running backs here. But suddenly we're having opportunities where some guys are kind of breaking away from their teams. And so we are looking at, first one here is Micah Bernard, running back out of Utah. Again, had him as my honorable mention last week. And all he did was just go off again against Utah State this past week. He has been a huge part of this offense the last 2 weeks. 19 attempts, 118 yards versus Baylor. 17 attempts, 123 yards versus Utah State. A touchdown in each of those games. This also helps that this is a historically good running back situation with, Andy Ludwig and Kyle Whittingham. Think of guys like Tavion Thomas in 2021, Ty Jordan 2020, and Zach Moss in 2019, and the list goes on from there. But really, the past 2 years have been a pretty big mess at the position. Granted, Bernard's been a big part of that. This year was expected to be much of the same with, Bernard, Jalen Glover, who, by the way, has basically disappeared, and, Mike Mitchell coming in. All of these guys were expected to be pretty viable options for the Utes. However, the last 2 weeks have made it very clear that Bernard is going to be a pretty big focal point of this rushing offense moving forward. It was to me, it's unclear if this was always the plan for the Utes or if this is kind of being done out of necessity. The point in favor of them always planning to do this was the fact that Bernard did hit the portal this offseason, and the staff went out of their way to lure him back to the team. So I think clearly the staff had some pretty big plans for Bernard to convince him to come back. Either that or Bernard got into the portal and nobody wanted him. I don't think that's what happened, but maybe it was. The other thing that points to the fact that, maybe this wasn't always planned is the fact that his volume really came after Cam Rising got injured, and that's kind of forced the team to change its approach on offense, especially when you got a true freshman back there in Isaac Williams behind center. Regardless of how it came about, I think Bernard's a clear add to CFF teams right now, given the history of Whittingham's running backs, given the fact that we've seen him get 19 plus touches and break 100 yards in 2 back-to-back games here. They got a really nice Big 12 schedule ahead. I think he'll have plenty of opportunities to put up some big performances down the line. Another committee buster here with Raj Harris, running back out of East Carolina, rostered in 12% of leagues. This past week, 18 carries, 87 yards. Didn't find the end zone, but if you look at his performance the week before against Old Dominion, 26 carries, 131 yards, and 2 touchdowns. This has the makings of a committee buster. Last year, without Keaton Mitchell, the running back situation for East Carolina was very much in flux the entire time. It looks like, to me, this is a classic case of the staff looking at their senior running back here, a veteran of the program, and they're giving him one last hurrah. Because that's all I can really say. Because going into the season, it really looked like we were going to have a committee situation with Harris, Javis Bond, Marlon Gunn, all coming back with pretty healthy levels of experience. And it looked like that was what we were going to get in the first game against Norfolk. Harris only got 7 touches in that game, but then things changed once they got into some even level of competition here. I was about to say conference competition, but I know Old Dominion's in Sun Belt and Harris or in East Carolina's the AAC. Regardless, a relatively even level of competition here, and that's where Harris got his 26 carries against the Monarchs. And so, to me, as long as Harris continues to break away from the rest of his backfield and the carries, I think he has to be rostered as many places as possible. Through 3 games, Harris has 50 carries. Meanwhile, the next closest running back, which is Marlon Gunn, has 15. Like I said, the staff seems to be letting him, as a senior, have one last road to glory in his final year, and I think that's going to spell great things down the road. And even better, according to our numbers at C2C Winning Edge, East Carolina has the easiest schedule in the country. That means plenty of opportunities for the Pirates to either lead in games or be forced into some even shootouts between them. For back like Harris, I think that's a win-win scenario, and I would absolutely be adding him in as many leagues as I can this week. Next up is another committee buster. I will say this is not one that I had on my list last week, but got a really good look at him this week when I watched the UGA Kentucky game. God rest my soul for sitting through that. But I got a really good look at Dei Sumo. I am not going to pronounce the last part of his last name. I'm sure that it is a very, like he added that onto his last name, and I'm sure he's trying to honor somebody there, but I'm not going to dishonor it by trying to butcher it. So he will be Dei Sumo, aka Slimy Shark, for me. Kentucky was a weird team to really follow during the offseason, right? We know for a fact that guys like Chris Rodriguez and Ray Davis have been top backs for the Wildcats. They have been phenomenal for CFF. Heck, Ray Davis was a top 5 back in CFF last year. But that kind of looked like it was something of the past heading into the season, right? At first, Kentucky added Ohio State transfer Chip Trayanum to be their next workhorse. However, as the spring and fall kind of progressed, it was pretty clear that Trayanum wasn't really separating himself, and the likes of, Dei Sumo and true freshman Jason Patterson were both in position to kind of eat into his carries. Then Trayanum broke his hand, which may have killed any remaining hope for him this year. But what's gone on in Trae Adams' absence? The Wildcats began with a committee approach, as many teams did, especially against FCS competition, right? Pretty much what we expected. But as the weeks have gone on, Dei Sumo has become the top choice for Mark Stoops and his staff. Again, he saw carries increase from 8 carries against Southern Miss to 17 carries against South Carolina to 22 carries against Georgia. And that Georgia performance was especially impressive. Again, 22 carries for 98 yards against that Georgia defense that, has shut down Kentucky running backs in the past quite a bit. I mean, Ray Davis struggled against them last year. So he's granted, again, Dei Sumo has 100% been helped by the fact that Trae Adams has been out. Jason Patterson was out in last week's game. So there's basically nobody in that backfield except for Dei Sumo and Wilcox. But Wilcox isn't that great of a running back in the first place. And so Dei Sumo has been getting a ton of carries here. If Brock Vandergriff continues to limit this passing game, I think that Dei Sumo will continue to get more and more workload down the stretch. And again, I'm not sure he really gives up this job. He's been performing extremely well this point in the season. He has Ohio on deck this week before Trae Adams potentially returns. I would definitely start Dei Sumo against Ohio this week. If you're concerned about Trae Adams, you should at least get that one big performance out of him. And then we'll see where things go from there. They got Ole Miss after that and then a bye week. So we'll see. But at least for this week, I think Dei Sumo is an excellent add. Let's look at our next running back here, and that is Billy Lucas, the running back out of Liberty, rostered in 3% of leagues. This is another committee buster, but this time, unfortunately, it is because of an injury, like directly because of an injury. Quentin Cooley went down in the game against UTEP this past week. No official word has been given so far, but head coach Jamie Chadwell is quoted saying it doesn't look good, and the online rumor currently is that we might be looking at a season-ending injury there. And so if that is the case, Lucas is in for a really big workload down the stretch. Like we saw that clearly in the game against UTEP this past week, where Lucas had 21 rushing attempts for 104 yards and 3 touchdowns. And people remember, this is actually exactly what happened to Quentin Cooley last year. The rest of the running back room got hurt. Quentin Cooley was durable. Even as they were kind of coming back, they slow played those guys coming back. And so Cooley had himself some excellent games on the stretch. I think if history repeats itself, Lucas is about to have a monster year down the stretch. He's looked really good so far. Again, obviously, 2.9 yards versus New Mexico State is a little to be desired there. But otherwise, again, if he does continue to do what he did against UTEP here, I think that he'll continue to have a monster year. Especially, like I said, if Salter continues to not score for whatever reason, Billy Lucas has been a huge beneficiary of the lack of scoring from Salter, given he got 3 touchdowns last week. So I like Billy Lucas moving forward. I think that he is basically whatever you wanted Quentin Cooley to be. I think Billy Lucas is about to become that. Last running back here is another committee buster. This is the one I'm the least confident about. I will be fully honest, but I did want to bring him up because I do like what he has done so far, and that is Christian Washington, the running back out of Coastal Carolina. Volume here not as high as I'd like it to be, but as I kind of mentioned, I'm looking for guys that are kind of clearly pulling away from their backfield, right? So far, Washington, over the first 3 games of the season, he had 13 touches in the game against Jacksonville State. Against William and Mary, he had himself 18 opportunities there, 16 rushing attempts, and then 2 targets. And then in the game against Temple, he had 18 opportunities there once again. Again, I'd like to see that get a little bit higher, but, like I said, he's breaking away. He's got 44 carries compared to the next running back, which is Braden Bennett, who has 16. The big thing that I'm worried about with Washington is how much of this is him benefiting from the fact that he's the only current healthy running back for Coastal Carolina. Of all the running backs that have taken a snap for Coastal Carolina this year, Washington is currently the only one that has played in all 3 games. The other ones have all had reasons for one or another to be benched in a game or 2. And so that has benefited Washington greatly here, but what happens when the likes of, Braden Bennett, who didn't play this past week, what happens when he comes back? Darren Lloyd as well missed the game. And it's not like these guys are scrubs, right? Like Bennett's been averaging 6.3 yards per carry. Lloyd's been averaging 7.6. Heck, all of them actually average more than Christian Washington. But we've seen this before in the past where, again, just being healthy. What's the old cliche? Your best ability is availability. Washington currently has that. He's got a matchup with Virginia this week. I obviously don't love that. Then he's got a bye, but then Coastal Carolina is full on in the Sun Belt, and I think Washington will have himself some nice games there, especially if the return of guys like Braden Bennett and Darren Lloyd and Javin Simpkins don't throw him off too much. Again, definitely among the lower priorities of running backs this week, but I don't think there's like a ton of running backs I would add off the waiver wire this week to give you an idea. But there are a couple of guys I'm keeping my eye on, and another one I have to remind you of. Guys, Braylon Sloan, the most important running back ad of last week, in my opinion, still at 28%. I got to mention him here again. If he's still available in your leagues, you need to go change that. He's going to be an absolute monster once action starts. You'll see it here against Central Michigan this upcoming weekend. Two true freshmen that I got to keep my eye on right now. I'm not declaring them official ads yet because I want to see what their respective staffs do with them here in the next couple of weeks. But Fluff, both well. The running back out of South Alabama has been super impressive so far this season, averaging over 5 yards per rush in every game that he's had. He's found the end zone in every single game. He is right there with Kentrell Bullock as the top back in this offense. Granted, Braylon McReynolds has been in and out with injury a little bit, but once again, true freshman on the same level as some of these other guys. That's very impressive, and he had a monster game this past week. 7 rushing attempts, 143 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Obviously, the volume's not there for me yet, but given that level of performance, he's straight up outperforming. He's outperforming Kentrell Bullock on a pretty down-to-down basis right now. I would say I wouldn't be shocked if over the next coming weeks we see both maybe start to take over this backfield a little bit, but not an official ad yet. Similar with Kadin Durham, the running back, true freshman running back out of LSU, rostered in 19% of leagues. LSU has struggled so far to run the ball this year, and it really did not help that John Emery Jr., who finally it looked like was going to have himself a really, really solid year, goes down with a torn ACL. Guy just cannot catch a break. And between Josh Williams and Caleb Jackson, neither of them could really get anything going. And in this game against South Carolina, where LSU had to run the ball to win this game, Durham stepped up big time. 11 rushing attempts, 98 yards, and 2 touchdowns in this game. That's the kind of performance where you go out there and you basically will your team to a win there. I think we'll see Durham get some more carries here in the next couple of weeks and potentially take over that LSU backfield if he continues to perform well. Again, I'm not there yet. I'm not saying he's an official ad. This is very much more of a watch list kind of deal. Or if you're in a deeper league, stick him on your bench and see what happens over the next couple of weeks. All right, that's the running backs. Let's move on to these wide receivers here. I got quite a few wide receivers to get through here. I got 6 of them that I'm officially going through here today. And I'll be real with y'all. Had a real hard time narrowing down some of these guys. Like, I legit thought about just throwing all these wide receiver names into a hat and just picking out 6 of them and just seeing what I could get out of it. But I did narrow it down, and once we get to the honorable mentions, I'll tell you guys there are plenty of wide receivers to grab off this week. And quite frankly, some of the guys in the honorable mention you could absolutely argue are higher priority than some of the guys that I am talking about here. So we'll start with the first one here. Cade McDonald, wide receiver out of Miami of Ohio, rostered in 5% of leagues. I am surprised at myself and the rest of the CFF community that there really wasn't more discussion this offseason about the Miami Redhawks wide receiver 1. Chuck Smith has been a face of the MAC since his start as head coach in 2014, and part of his brand in recent years especially has been some really top-end wide receiver production year after year. If you're a veteran CFF player, you remember recent names like Gage Larvadane last year, who had 24 targets in his first 2 games before he got hurt. Mac Hippenhammer in 2022, 100 targets in that season. Jack Sorensen, who had 1,200 yards in 2021 on 107 targets. this is a system that produces a top-end wide receiver for CFF so long as they stay healthy. And it looks like Cade McDonald is set to carry on that mantle. In the first 3 weeks of the season, we've seen 2 games out of Miami of Ohio, and McDonald has averaged 10 targets per game and has seen 100-plus yards in both matchups. And the crazy thing and impressive thing is that both of these performances have come against Power 4 level competition. Against Northwestern, he pulled in 8 catches for 105 yards there, and then followed it up after the bye week with 8 catches for 135 yards, and a touchdown against Cincinnati. Obviously, neither of those teams are, juggernaut of the Big 12, juggernaut of the Big 10 or anything like that. But the fact that if McDonald can do that consistently against tougher competition like that, right? What happens when Miami of Ohio's schedule shifts to, the MAC after this date with Notre Dame this week, right? Between the system history, the performance so far, and the upcoming schedule, everything to me is lining up for McDonald to be a key add down the stretch for CFF. I think he's absolutely a priority add for CFF teams struggling with wide receiver production right now. Another guy that I can bring up here that I actually had as a honorable mention last week, but I wanted to see him do it again, and guess what? He did it again. Andrew Armstrong, wide receiver out of Arkansas. He is someone that, like I said, after 13 targets against Oklahoma State, where he caught the ball 10 times for 164 yards, I put him as an honorable mention, but I wanted to give it one more week to see what was up with Armstrong, because he had some pretty up and down performances last week. Granted, he never reached 13 targets last year, but like I said, he followed it up with a very strong week 2 performance here. Another 13 targets in this game, pulled in 8 catches for 137 yards. He's yet to find the end zone, but when you're getting 13 targets a game, you're getting that kind of volume, that will eventually rectify itself. Now, granted, Arkansas has a ton of guys that they can run the ball with, including quarterback Taylon Green, but again, Armstrong, things will get rectified there. The rehiring of Bobby Petrino may not make Arkansas fans feel very good when they go to church on Sundays, but the offensive returns are pretty clear as day. This Razorback offense looks much more competent this year than what we've seen in recent years. Ignore the sluggish first half against UAB there. But regardless of anything else, Armstrong's a pretty huge part of this team moving forward. Even with only 2 games played, he's already the number 1 target on the year for the Razorbacks. And to me, there's very little doubt that'll stop anytime soon. It is a pretty rough schedule moving forward. Again, 5 of his next 6 opponents are ranked in the AP top 25. However, with Taylon Green at quarterback, I think Armstrong's always going to have a chance to kind of score late in games. Arkansas has the ability to kind of score some garbage time touchdowns. I think Armstrong will heavily benefit from that and some really strong game script for him. So I like Armstrong a lot moving forward. So next up, we have Luke Floria, wide receiver at Kent State. Another guy I had as my honorable mention last week. This week I'm making an official play, which sounds kind of weird because if you look at the stats on the screen, he had a piss poor performance this past week against Tennessee, but to be fair, so did the rest of Kent State. He had 4 targets, 3 catches, 13 yards. His games before that, though, are what we're really looking at here. His partner in crime, Christian McCray, is pretty already well-known quantity among CFF circles. But McCray, even though he currently leads the Golden Flashes in targets, Floria has actually been the more consistent receiver through 3 weeks. Out of the slot, Floria has brought in 70+% of his targets. Meanwhile, McCray is struggling to hit 50% of his targets. And Floria has actually been able to generate more yards after the catch than McCray, which leads to their disparity in production despite McCray's advantage in the opportunities. So in the first 2 games of the season, Floria had himself a really nice start here, right? Against Pitt, Floria was targeted 11 times, caught the ball 6 times for 104 yards and a touchdown. He followed that up against St. Francis, where he had 8 targets, 6 catches, 92 yards, and a touchdown. Again, I'm ignoring the Tennessee result, given the fact that the entire Kent State team got absolutely destroyed. I wouldn't start him, obviously, this week. He's got Penn State here. He's got one more big flogging here. But after that, it's nothing but smooth sailing through the MAC. And Floria should be able to thrive there, which as he did do very admirably last year when McCray went down last year. During that stretch, he had 2 10-plus target games, 90-yard games. This offense, even though it's clearly not there yet, it's still a pretty rough offense. They at least understand the very basic concept of, hey, throw to number 2. Hey, throw to Christian McCray. Let's utilize our 2 top receivers here, and we'll ride on these guys. So Floria should benefit from that over the next couple of weeks. I like where Kent State can go with him. Next up is wide receiver Devontae Ross out of Troy, rostered on 6% of leagues. I wasn't heavily targeting players out of Troy to start this or during the offseason because I really did not know what to expect in this team. The one thing I did think I could expect was Damian Taylor leading this backfield, and boy oh boy have the coaching staff at Troy really pissed me off with the way that they've been handling that so far. But one thing that they have not disappointed on is Devontae Ross's production so far. Against Nevada, he had 11 targets, 7 catches for 102 yards and a touchdown there. Against Memphis, the game plan sucked. Only 5 targets for Ross, 3 catches, 27 yards. So very much a sinker performance. But against Iowa, which is, we all know, is no stinker of a defense, Ross had himself a game. 9 targets, 5 catches, 142 yards, and 2 touchdowns on the day. It is very clear through 3 weeks that Ross is the best thing on this Troy offense, and there is nobody close. You look at what he's done compared to the other receivers on this team, he's a tier above. He's only got 7 more targets than Peyton Higgins, but he has 18.1 yards per reception and 3 touchdowns compared to Peyton Higgins' 7.6 yards per catch and 0 touchdowns. Landon Parker's the other starting wide receiver. He has only 11 targets and is struggling down there at 10.8. Ross is a tier above all of these guys. And to me, when you have a guy like Ross have a performance like he does against Power 4 competition like Iowa, I think it's only going to make it to where they're going to want to throw him the ball even more than they have so far already. And so, what does this mean going forward? This means going forward, I actually like Ross quite a bit. He's got Florida A&M this week. He's got UML Monroe. He's got Texas State. Literally look at the rest of the schedule, and if he keeps up this production that he has been getting so far against teams not named Memphis, where do you sit him among this schedule? Again, Florida A&M, UL Monroe, Texas State, South Alabama, Arkansas State, Coastal Carolina, Georgia Southern, Louisiana, Southern Miss. Where's the sit? If Ross continues to do what he's doing, he is absolutely a priority add on the waiver wire this week. Next wide receiver I want to throw up here is Mr. Keyshawn Johnson, the wide receiver out of Western Kentucky, rostered on 18% of leagues this year. Trust me, y'all. I am as shocked as you are that the leading receiver of Western Kentucky is neither Easton Messer, who, he's still doing all right. 16 targets through 3 games, 135 yards, a touchdown. Nothing crazy, but, at least he's still second on the team in targets. Nor is the leading receiver Dalvin Smith, which, what the hell is going on with him? 3 games, 10 targets, 7 catches, 75 yards, and a touchdown. 6 on the team in targets. Like, that's not even good, even if he still had his tight end eligibility. If he still had his tight end eligibility, he'd be the biggest bust at tight end right now among all of the options. Johnson's come onto the scene, and he has proven to be the top option for the Hilltoppers so far this year. He's a transfer from Alabama State, where last year he had 88 targets in 10 games, 59 catches, 819 yards, and 7 touchdowns. He's come to West Kentucky, and like I said, he's taken over so far. If he keeps this pace up through CUSA matchups, boy oh boy, sky is the limit. And based on, again, on this past week's performance with Kadin Camp at the helm, this offense is good enough to do so, and Keyshawn Johnson could be one of the priority adds for the rest of the season. I really want to give a shout out to George at G Carlto on Twitter for reaching out to me about Johnson last week and bringing him to my attention. Again, I personally just hadn't really looked at Western Kentucky's target distribution, which shame on me, but even still, I was a little hesitant on Johnson. I wanted to make sure Johnson's role was legit. He only had one more target than Messer and Barry at that point. I did note that his snap numbers were clearly higher than the rest of the team. But man, shout out to George. Like, you believed in him, and you're on it. And again, I really want to thank George especially because, like, to me, George, what he did here was exactly what I hope a lot of you guys do out there as you listen to this show. As much as I love just, like, bringing names up for you guys, like, what I really like to see is people taking my thought process, people taking the things I talk about whenever I am deciding which people to target in waivers, taking the things they've learned from this pod, things to look out for, and applying it yourself. This kind of stuff, like with Keyshawn Johnson, with George and everything, that's the kind of stuff that happens when you learn from this pod and use it on your own. George beat me to a guy like Johnson because of his own ingenuity, because of his own research and applying this kind of stuff on his own. Because of that, George is actually gonna probably own 100% of the Johnson shares in the league that he has and thrive because of it, because he was able to look at it and beat me. I'm just a big megaphone. I'm doing what a lot of other people are already doing, and I'm just the guy to say, like, hey, these are the guys that I'm seeing. If you take what you learn, it's quite possible for you to find this stuff even a week before I do, because me, I'm personally a little conservative sometimes when it comes to attacking some of these guys. So again, shout out George. Well done there, sir. And Johnson's absolutely one of the priority ads at wide receiver. Last name I want to mention here and go in depth on, I'll definitely talk a lot about the honorable mention wide receivers, but Gallus Jackson, wide receiver out of Washington, 10% rostered on Fantrax here. We talked all off season. Denzel Boston, Jeremiah Hunter, those are the guys getting drafted in leagues. But if y'all actually recall, back in August, when I had Joe Arpazi on for the wide receiver crash course, we did talk quite a bit of Washington, and he made a good note. Like, Joe made a good note at that point that Jedd Fisch typically actually has more success with his slot receivers than he does with his outside wide receivers. Ted McMillan was the exception because Ted McMillan is incredible. So we did kind of throw on the idea that, like, if Gallus Jackson starts in the slot, maybe there's a possibility of him doing well, but we didn't really go that far with it. Like, I wasn't drafting him in every league or anything like that. Well, so far this season, it's actually showing up pretty well for Jackson so far. Again, 10 targets, 6 targets, and 8 targets. Quietly, he is the number one target on this Washington offense here. And the crazy thing is he's actually caught every single one of these balls. Now, the big caveat with Jackson is the way that Jedd Fisch is running this offense so far for Washington. You're still seeing the outside guys like Boston and Hunter getting more of those touchdown opportunities than Jackson. In fact, it was only this past week that Jackson was actually able to finally find the end zone. That was on a long pass. Jackson does a ton of the dirty work between the 20s. Meanwhile, when they get down to the red zone, that's where they hand it off to guys like Jonah Coleman. That's where they give those outside shots, back shoulder fades to the outside wide receivers, and Jackson's role disappears just a little bit down there. So I'm concerned about his scoring opportunities, but in a PPR league, I think Jackson's a must-add. I had him last week. Now, granted, again, I didn't expect 162 yards against Washington State, but even still, I think Jackson's absolutely worth adding in PPR leagues. I'm a little concerned about the touchdown distribution for them moving forward, but regardless, like, this is the kind of guy that I like, a guy you just get opportunities over and over again every single week. Washington's got a decent schedule moving forward. Again, obviously, well, I say that actually. They got Rutgers and Michigan as two of their upcoming 3 opponents, but even still, I think Jackson will be a big part of it moving forward. Definitely a PPR ad. Honorable mentions, good lord, there's a lot of them. Amari Kelly, wide receiver out of Middle Tennessee State, rostered in 20% of leagues. This was very much a finally performance this past week. Boy, it took Kelly a little bit to get going here. But in this past week against Western Kentucky, 9 targets, 9 receptions, 239 yards, and 3 touchdowns. I think that you will see Kelly continue to perform well as the season goes on for Middle Tennessee State. Hopefully this offense in general just gets better. We don't need to rely on Kelly scoring every touchdown for the Blue Raiders here. But so far this season, 6 targets against Tennessee Tech, 7 targets against Ole Miss, which he only caught 1 of those. Wasn't great. And then 9 targets against Western Kentucky. To me, clearly number 1 option for this passing attack, at least among the wide receivers. Actually, let me double check that real quick. I just want to make sure I'm not talking fully out of my butt there. Yeah. Number 1 target, only a little bit ahead of Holden Willis, but regardless, like, his efficiency is insane right now. Obviously, last week was pretty insane. I think that he'll continue to do well. Dejon Stribling, I touched on him earlier when I was talking about Alan Bowman. He is the number 1 target among the outside wide receivers for Oklahoma State. Obviously, Brenton Presley still beats him there, but in terms of efficiency, Stribling's done well. I think that he'll continue to do well down the stretch as the top option for Mike Gundy on the outside, which has always been a hyper-productive system spot for CFF. Pat Bryant, a little up and down for my taste, but clearly Luke Altmaier loves finding him in the end zone. He's got 2 touchdowns against Eastern Illinois. He's got 2 touchdowns against Central Michigan. Couldn't find the end zone against Kansas, but still 3 receptions for 70 yards in that game. So I like what I've seen out of Pat Bryant so far. Him and Zachary Franklin, I think, will go back and forth, but definitely worth mentioning. I'll eat a little bit of crow on Dante Wright. I had him as a waiver wire trap last week, and all he did was just prove me wrong. Against Coastal Carolina, 10 targets, 9 receptions, 99 yards, and another touchdown there, scoring 21 fantasy points on half PPR formats there. I don't want to make him an official play because I want to see him do it 3 times, and he's got a really good opportunity this week to do so. He's got Utah State on deck. If he does it 3 times in a row, I'll add him as an official play next week. I mentioned Tucker Gleason earlier. We'll talk about his top target here in Junior Vander Ross out of Toledo. 7 targets, 6 targets, 9 targets. He has hit 73 plus yards in each of the last 2 games. He's scored a touchdown in every game so far. Very, very solid play there. And then, did I lose my other? There it is. Yeah, there we go. There's the rest of my wide receiver honorable mentions. Other honorable mentions, Taylor Morton at Wake Forest is getting interesting for me. Oh, good Lord. Mostly as a PPR ad. Again, it's very similar actually to Giles Jackson, where, the slot guy, he gets volume. He gets solid production here. He had 100 yards against North Carolina A&T, 91 against Virginia, 77 versus Ole Miss this past week. He's got 24 targets on the year so far, so averaging 8 targets a game. Problem is, he's just not finding the end zone. So PPR format, I am very okay with Taylor Morton. But in terms of a standard league, probably not as excited there. A couple of deeper plays. For those of you in deeper leagues here. Skylar Bell out of UConn. Again, I kind of mentioned him last week, and again, continues. He is, in my opinion, looks like the number 1 guy here. 13 targets versus Duke this past week, 58 yards. I'm not holding that against him too much. Again, it is power forward competition. You are playing for UConn. That's kind of the main thing, right? Like, I like the volume that he's getting. I like the efficiency. I like the production from Bell. The problem is that UConn's just a team similar to Temple with Dante Wright that's just not going to score very much, and so your touchdown opportunities are definitely going to hurt a bit there. Some other deeper names here. Ron Singleton, wide receiver out of Eastern Michigan, rostered in 2% of leagues. His performance against Washington in week 2 was pitiful. 1 catch, 1 yard, whoop-de-freaking-do. I'm more interested in what he's able to do against some even level competition. Against UMass, 9 targets, 8 catches, 89 yards, and a touchdown. Against Jacksonville State, 10 targets, 8 receptions, 89 yards in that game as well. I think that he is a guy that could be a very sneaky play once we get fully into MAC here. And then the last one here is Ted Hurst, wide receiver out of Georgia State, rostered in 1% of leagues. This is a guy that I do not want to make an official play yet. And it's going to take a while for us to really know what's going on here. But I think you need to pay attention to some guys that are slowly but surely clearly earning more work each week. He had 3 targets against Georgia Tech, 2 catches, 26 yards. He got 7 targets against Chattanooga, 6 catches, 83 yards, and a touchdown. Then against Vanderbilt this past week, a Power 4 level competition, 11 targets, 7 catches, 128 yards, and 2 touchdowns. His stats, every single stat that you would look at, is going up and up for the first 3 weeks. Now, obviously, I do not think that happens every single week. I don't think that trend line continues, clearly. But I do think it is very interesting to note how quickly he has earned a top spot. Maybe this comes all crashing down to earth in 2 weeks. They got to buy this week, so it will take a while to really know. But Hurst is 100%, if you utilize that watch list on Fantrax, 100% a guy I would look out for. Last but not least here, let's touch on our tight end option. I got my slides all out of order. Good job, Jared. I'm only going to talk about really one that I'm not going to say I'm super excited for. Again, I think there's no real savior at tight end off the waiver wire this week. I talked about Tanner Koziol last week. He's still available in a lot of leagues. He's like 28% rostered right now. If he's available, I would prioritize him over the name I'm about to mention. But the name I will mention here is Eli Wilson, the tight end out of Appalachian State. This Appalachian State passing game's been a source for some great CFF wide receivers in the past, but not really somewhere that people have looked for CFF tight end production. However, if you did go and look at Wilson's production last year, lo and behold, he did actually finish as the tight end 32 last year. Not good enough to be a starting CFF tight end or anything, but clearly it was an indication of potentially something more down the line here. Now it's a senior season. Wilson's a pretty clear part of this Mountaineer passing games moving forward. He's seen 4+ targets in each of his first 3 games. Even saw 7 against East Carolina this past week. He's found the end zone in every game that wasn't against an opponent named Clemson. So whenever they're down in the red zone, clearly Aguilar is looking for his nice big target here. I don't think he's going to be good enough to really be like a big positional advantage, but I think he'll be able to provide a solid floor, especially if you're playing in a PPR or a tight end premium league here. I'll throw out some honorable mentions. Again, I already mentioned Tanner Koziol. The other name I'll throw out here is a guy that has 4 targets through week 2, and then last week against Georgia State, he had 17 targets, which, whoa, where did that come from? But it also makes sense when you think about it. And that's Eli Stowers, the tight end at Vanderbilt. Like I mentioned, 17 targets this past week, 9 receptions, 110 yards, and a touchdown there. It makes sense when you think about the fact that Stowers did come with Diego Pavia from New Mexico, came over from Jerry Kill, knows this offense. I do think that we're going to see a healthy medium between what we've seen with Stowers in the first 2 weeks versus what we saw last week. I think that Pavia is going to need him to need a solid safety blanket option. I think Stowers will become that for him. So if you're in a deeper league and you're struggling to find a consistent tight end, I think Stowers is worth a shot on. So that being said, last thing we'll cover for this week is our DST streaming options for this week for those of you who are looking for some DSTs to drop and to pick up for this week. Minnesota's been good to us the last couple of weeks. We're going to continue riding that train. They got themselves a nice little shutout last week against Nevada. I don't expect a shutout this week, but they are playing Iowa. I have not looked at the betting lines for this game, but I would bet good money that this is the lowest over-under total of the week. Both these teams, physical teams, both these teams love to run the ball. This will be a low-scoring, quick affair between these two. Next up, we got South Carolina. They're rostered on 8% of rosters right now. Their DST is at least. They get Akron this week. Yes, I know. Old Dominion put up like 19 points against South Carolina and really gave South Carolina a scare there. Guys, Akron's a really not good team this year. I think South Carolina will be more than good enough to hold them out of the end zone. I'm liking that matchup this week. Pittsburgh, I initially was thinking about the fact they gave up 24 points to Kent State to start the year, and I'm like, oh, maybe it's not just a very not good defense in general. But went back and looked, that even with 24 points scored against them, this DST still scored 32 points. Why? They're pretty opportunistic. And so I like the idea of Pitt going up against a FCS team this week. I like the idea of, even if Pitt lets up a few points, that, it's an FCS team. They're ripe for a special teams touchdown or two on Pittsburgh's side of things. So I think that could be really good for them. Indiana's defense, I actually don't even know if this is really all that good of a defense, but man, they've been so good the first 3 weeks. I think they've scored 30 plus points in each of their matchups so far. They get Charlotte this week. Charlotte is an absolute train wreck of a team right now. I wouldn't trust them with anything right now. And so I think Indiana handily takes care of them this week. And then last but not least, I am putting out there Kentucky's defense. One, you saw what they were able to do to Georgia's offense last week. Granted, a lot of that was Georgia shooting itself in the foot at times, but even still, very impressive performance from them. They get Ohio this week. And yes, before some of you asked, that does mean I am probably sitting the likes of Anthony Tyus, Coleman Owens, and the like this week. So we'll just go ahead and get ahead of that for the Start to Sit show later this week. All right. With that, we have come to the end of our show. Appreciate all of you guys for listening. If you have not already, leave a like, a comment, and a subscribe. If you're watching this on the YouTube side of things, if you're on the podcast side of things, make sure you follow the show. Leave a 5-star review wherever you can. Make sure you guys check out the rest of the Campus to Canton podcast network for shows ranging on pretty much anything you can think of related to the college fantasy game. We'll see you guys back here on Wednesday when we get ready for week 4 of the college fantasy season with another round of Start and Sit questions. Until then, really appreciate you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful and blessed week. See ya.